Hello, Kristen.
Hi, Greg.
How are you today?
I'm good. We are
What's
back to talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I
we
think.
are. It's a
Yeah.
current thing. People are talking about it a lot. And we had a lot of fun in the first part of the conversation,
Yes.
in no small part because we found that we had a lot of, shockingly for you and me, we had a lot of excitement and passion around the
Yeah.
topic.
Yeah.
So we talked about diversity and we talked about equity and what it meant. We talked about having a very capitalist approach to business, which we both agree with. What
Mhm.
do we have in front of us for today?
I think we talked a lot about diversity and we talked a lot about equity, and we didn't really get to inclusion. So we should talk
Agreed.
about inclusion.
I love it.
So
Okay.
what are your thoughts on that?
I think that as a leader, inclusion is a thing you just do every day. There are actions you take in running meetings, in how you distribute work, in how you ask for input. I think all of those are the actions of inclusion. And there are ways to do it well and ways to do it poorly. Not at all surprisingly, much of it is related to what we have talked about in other circumstances, but
Hmm.
it's really relevant here because I think it's what differentiates the leaders that we all want to be.
Hmm.
What about you? What do you think?
Yeah. And we were talking about this before we hopped on and started recording. We should
Yes,
sometimes hit the
I
record
know.
button right away. But one of the things that it made me think about is how even on a set team or even a small team, there is a lot of diversity in terms of people's strengths. And one of
Yeah,
the tools that I've used in the past to help make sure that I'm using people's strengths to the best that of my ability as a leader
yeah,
is Strengths Finder, which is
yes,
a survey that's been out for a long time. And the whole premise behind it is that it is more efficient and effective to leverage your biggest strengths than it is to try to spend a bunch of time working on your weaknesses.
yes.
And so for the last probably now 15 years
Ooh,
with all of my teams, I have had everybody on the team take a Strengths Finder assessment
that's
and
fantastic.
use that to look at a couple of things. Some of it is just my personal curiosity. I also think it helps me be a better coach for individuals so I can coach people to their strengths. But also, it helps me understand, like, if I were to have a brainstorming session, who are the people on my team who I should make sure I include in the brainstorming session because it will be more effective with their brains in the room? Or how do I balance my team so that I have some of the gaps in our strengths are filled in by other people? What should I be looking for?
Yeah,
How should I balance things out? But it helps me make sure that I'm thinking about like who to include in different things, but also by having a broad set of strengths across the team, when I include everybody in discussions, I can make sure that I'm getting a lot of different perspectives and it's really broad and I'm getting the most brain power on a
yeah.
particular issue. So I think
Really,
there's lots of different ways you could look at that.
I really like how deliberate that is as you're describing it, which is to say, not kind of waiting for it to show up, but being planful about it. I really like StrengthsFinder, and I think they went through a rebrand a few years ago, and
Hmm.
now they call themselves Clifton Strengths, which is great. It's just a matter, I think, who owns them. But even more interesting than that, not that this is a commercial for StrengthsFinder, although it's going to be a little bit. It's based in positive psychology, and
Yeah.
as a branch of psychology, positive psychology is relatively new. So psychology isn't
Hmm.
as a discipline is not that old, and it began, as you would imagine, with people who were crazy, right?
Hmm.
So, and any forgive me, any person, any psychologist listening to us, yes, I know what I just said was awful, but I'm gonna just go with me for a minute.
Yeah.
So it's based on a medical model of when people are below functional level, right? So,
Hmm.
so whether it was early Freudian psychoanalysis, current psychoanalysis, the behaviorism of Skinner and others in the middle of the last century, and on and on and on. And I think a lot of what is now really starting to get some traction in positive psychology was overlapped with pop psychology and kind of dismissed by what psychology does. But what it does well, and what strengths, because Clifton Strengths does well, is just as you were saying, identifies for an individual kind of what their existing not even just their strengths, but their strengths, yes, but also their potentials, like areas where they are going to excel. And then from a positive psychology perspective, actually leaning into those. There's this
Mhm.
other school of thought that I think is, I get the logic of it, but it's wacky, which is to say, if you're already good at four things and you're not really good at four other things, you should totally focus on ones you're not good at. So you eventually get good at everything, which is not how that math works.
No.
Right? So,
It takes so much effort to get good at something you're bad at compared to just
yes,
getting better at something you're already
better at
kinda
something you're
good
good
at.
at. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what I like so much about Clifton Strengths and how it focuses there. The interesting thing too, though, as you describe it, and this is, I would say to anybody who's a leader who's listening to this, here's the challenge for you: get your own profile of in StrengthsFinder and look at what you're good at and make a plan for how you're going to build those. But look also at what you're less good at. Think about what it means to invite your subordinate
Mhm.
into a meeting or a conversation because you want that person to be good at something that you're not currently good at. There's a really necessary humility in that as a
Yeah.
leader. By the way, it's also, you just, the return on that investment is huge.
Yeah.
But once you accept that there's people on your team who are good at things that you're not good at, well, then inclusion becomes so much easier. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
It really
that's part
does.
of
I
what I
mean,
think.
I think, one of the most interesting things that I've done with that is look at our collective as a team at the Success League. And one of the
Mm,
things that we looked at, this was probably just after the pandemic, so maybe 3 years ago now.
mhm, mm,
We had a smaller team at that point, and when we looked at our collective strength finder, we everybody was really good at the stuff that kind of lends itself to customer facing roles, except for
yeah,
me, which is
interesting.
crazy because I run a
Yes.
customer success consulting firm, which you'd think I'd be okay at that, but I'm apparently not.
One
That's
would
not my
imagine,
biggest
yes.
strengths. And then there was only like two of us that were really strong on execution related
Mm,
strengths. And
mhm,
I was one of those. There was one other person on the team, and everything else was kind of like evenly spread. And so
mm,
when we went to go hire our next person, we really made sure that we tailored our search and our interviewing to try to get another person who was really strong on execution so we could kind of beef up that
yeah,
skill set in our team and
yep,
have more of a team of people who were less philosophical and more
yes,
execution oriented. And
yes,
so, that was an interesting exercise. I think the other thing that I've seen is just trends across different kinds of roles. I mean, I've managed sales teams, I've managed success teams and support teams, and there are certain strengths that always show up, and there are
mm,
certain strengths that never show up. And
interesting.
the one that never shows up, and because it's always customer facing teams that I'm leading, the
Yeah,
one that never shows up is belief. Because when you look at the description of the
yeah,
belief strength, it's a very black and white strength. You have
mhm.
certain things that you strongly believe and you stand up for those beliefs and you're very rigid around those things, which
Oh,
might be a good thing if you were like an engineer, right?
yes,
And you needed to
yes,
have certain things that are right and certain things that are wrong. But when you're
mhm.
working with people and people are very diverse,
You've got to be
you
flexible.
can't you can't have an attitude like that, or you're going to really have a problem in
That's
the
right.
role.
Yeah,
And so, it's been interesting to kind of look at those things. That's just more like my
that is really
personal
interesting. Yes.
research. But
Well, the thing, the piece of that kind of resonates, and kind of back to this point about inclusion is, I don't know this about Clifton Strengths, and maybe you do, but I don't know if they have done any studies of their tools against gender splits and ethnic splits and even generational splits. In other words, does everyone show up equally in Clifton Strengths data? Because if so, then using a tool like that to be the way that you round out your team, you're automatically going to be inviting a diverse group. You're automatically going to be creating an equitable circumstances, and you're going to be including people in ways that leverage their strengths, which is what we all want.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I'm
I
sure
don't
they
know.
have done that research. I don't think they're sharing it.
Well, I don't
Or
know
that I
because
know of.
I took a
So,
deep dive. So the Myers-Briggs organization. So if
mhm,
you're a leader and you're listening to this, there are a lot of different lenses through which you can look at human beings and categorize them. And I
mhm.
have not yet found one that is the best one forever.
Yeah.
I also haven't found one that wasn't useful in its own way. So the
Yeah.
Myers-Briggs personality type inventory, Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory is great. DISC is great. I
Mhm.
did one called In Color Insight. It was great. They all have their own
Yeah.
strengths, right? Myers-Briggs came under fire unfairly, in my opinion, some years ago, and they did in fact publish their equity research on how they're. I
Mhm.
mean, they're probably the most popular, and so they have a lot of good data
Mhm.
on who's been taking their courses or taking their assessments. So it would be. I think it'd be worth looking at. I might take that as a little action item for myself to see if
Yeah.
Clifton Strengths has done something similar because. I was in an organization where we were spending a lot of money on Myers-Briggs, and we ended up having to defend it because somebody
Yeah.
had heard about the criticism and so we had to kind of come back at that. So either way, but again, the point here is, and I think that it's a necessary point when we're in a DEI conversation, or in this case, the subset of an inclusion conversation, is you can't take any of that for granted. You can't take for granted that a tool like Clifton Strengths or the Myers-Briggs treats men and women the same. That
Yeah.
you can't take for granted that white people and black people are going to be treated the same by the tool. Um,
Yeah.
if you get the research and you can make that statement, then those are really amazing tools to rely on.
Yeah. Yeah.
What
I
are
just
other
had
ways that you've go ahead?
I was gonna say, I just had a thought while you were
Yes.
saying that. What role do you think that company culture or team culture plays in inclusion?
Oh my.
And how would you define team culture or company culture?
So team culture. So I think of them as related but different. So there's some overlap
Okay.
there. And when I used to do new manager training and new manager orientation, what I used to say was your team is going to have a culture, whether you are in front of it or not.
Yeah.
So it's going to just happen, right? It might be
Mhm.
the team. It might be the team culture where everyone ignores the manager, right? So, either
Yeah.
way, you're going to be the fun team, or you're going to be the team that gets things done, or you're going to be the slacker team, or the team where everybody's frustrated, whatever. And then, sort of underneath there, there's culture of how people support each other and how they engage. So, obviously, as a manager or as a leader, you have the opportunity to be in front of that, and to create the scenarios that allow people to engage in the way you want them to, right? So if you want to be the
Mhm.
we get stuff done team,
Mhm.
then your meetings are really focused in what did we accomplish and really focused in, how are we getting this done? And so on and so on and so on. The company culture part is kind of the same. But and here's the example I'll give you. The most recent role I had and it's really fun. I never talk about recent roles, but the most recent role I had was in a very large corporation based in the United States. The leader of that organization had decided that the company culture was more aggressive, more or less sort of feeling and compassionate than
Mhm.
this leader wanted. So this leader worked hard to create a different culture of inclusion, of
Mhm.
acceptance, of reward, and of support, and did it. Created exactly that culture, and the rest of the company, similar roles would turn over in you know 8 months to a year and a half. It was a really common
Mhm.
turnover. On this team, roles were turning over every 5 to 6 years, and some of them had
Oh,
not
wow.
turned over in
That's
8 or 9 years. People weren't going anywhere. So the
yeah.
culture was working. The problem is it reached a point where the team culture and the company culture were in conflict. And unfortunately, company culture wins in
Mhm.
that moment. So I think that ends up being the important piece of the relationship between the two of them. As a leader, you can and should have a culture on your team that matches you and matches who your team is
Mhm.
and matches kind of what you expect and what you need. But you've got to make sure you're dialed in enough with the company culture that it doesn't crush you when you're not paying attention. So it's
Yeah.
interesting. I haven't thought about the relationship of those two. What do you think about that?
I think when you're a team leader, you have an opportunity to create a culture of inclusion.
Yes.
I think, companies always wanted, well, up until very recently, have always wanted to talk about having
Yes.
a culture of inclusion, and
Mhm.
they don't always execute on that particularly well. But I also think, company culture, it gets sort of like mixed up with, oh, we have lunches brought in, or we have, video
Yes.
games and bean bags over in the corner you can hang
Yes.
out. You have unlimited PTO. Like
Right.
those are perks. Those aren't company culture.
So
And I
perfect.
think
Yes.
it's different. And so I think company culture has a real opportunity to play a part in inclusion, but also
Yes.
you with company culture, you run the risk of, like, if you're always trying to hire people that are a great fit for your culture, you run the risk of the culture creating this really homogenous
Boy, that's the
group
truth.
of people,
Mm.
and it kind of goes almost against the idea of creating a performance-based culture or an inclusive
Yeah.
culture, because you're just bringing in a whole bunch of the same kind of people that fit your culture. So I think you have to be a little careful about that.
It's a really good point, Kristen. I think that it that I think that not a lot of people would see that at the surface level. And it just to sort of say back the importance of what you just said. If what you're doing when you're interviewing, when you're bringing people in, is you're looking for a match for culture in a relatively short period of time, everyone looks the same and sounds the same and thinks the same. What a horrible work experience to have, because it feels really great for a minute, but then you realize you're missing so much necessary depth and richness in conversation and in decision making. And I think that's counterintuitive for people
Hmm.
to think that if we always hire to cultural fit, then we're always going to have a healthy, robust culture. And I don't think that's true. And that's
Yeah.
again, that's where it relates into inclusion,
Hmm.
is that you wouldn't naturally think of actively recruiting someone who has a different point of view, who has a different background, who has a different way of working.
Yeah. And I mean, you can think of this in terms of any kind of difference between people. Like age is what I think of. A lot of startups have a startup culture, right?
Sure.
Startup
Yes.
culture is thought of as super youthful,
Right.
people who want to stick around and work 20-hour days and sleep under
Yes.
their desks, or
Right.
whatever. If you're a mom and you're in your 40s, you don't want to do that. You know,
Right.
you don't have a lifestyle that supports that. But if you don't hire that person that has maybe more experience,
Hmm.
a broader perspective, you're going to miss out on that important skill set for your company
Yes.
as a startup. And so I think there's a balance to be had. Yes, you want people that match your culture, especially in terms of things like working style,
Yep.
pace,
Yeah.
but you also want a broad group of people so that you can match the customers you're trying to serve too.
Part of what I'm hearing you say, and I'm agreeing with it, but I want to say it out
Mhm.
loud to see how it works in
Yeah.
air, is inclusion. There's a requirement on employees for inclusion as well, right? So it's up to the leader
Mhm.
to make room and create the environment and to welcome diverse points of view. But but people that have a diverse point of view, the single mom who's 40, needs to be willing to show up in a space that doesn't immediately feel right. And so
Yeah.
there's something there about creating safety for that person, but really, I guess I don't know. There's a second half of inclusion, which is, you can invite them in the door. Once they're in, how do you make sure you're hearing from them?
Yeah. I
I
think
don't know, I'm
I
not sure
like
I'm saying that well, but
you're saying that really well. I think
mm,
it reminds me of this situation I had a support team at one point, and everybody on the support team was pretty similar in terms of their working style. And I had this one person who just did not fit the mold. She's about 20 years older than everybody else on the team.
mm,
She just wanted to come in, do her work, do a good job,
hmm
go home. Didn't want to hang out, didn't want to do
hmm
anything. And I thought that was bad at first. And then it turned
yeah,
out it actually was really good.
interesting. How come? What made you change your mind? Yeah, sorry. For those watching at home, Kristen is currently coughing. Right at the moment that I asked her to contribute something additional to the point she made, she was
Thanks
struggling a little.
for watching me cough, everybody. I'm getting over a cold if
And
you can't
watching me
tell.
laugh while you did it.
Yeah, watching Greg laugh at me while I cough, have a
Yes.
coughing fit. It's great.
There it is. That, in a
I'm
nutshell, the nature
sorry.
of our podcast.
I got
Yes.
distracted. What was your question again?
What you talked about, having someone on your team that wanted to come in and do her work and go home,
Yeah.
and that at first you thought that was bad, and then you realized that was actually a really necessary part of the team. What changed?
I think what I realized is that if all I had on my team was type A go-getter people, that those
Yeah.
people only had a certain length of time that they were going to be willing to be in a support role
Yeah.
before
Oh
they
yeah.
wanted to do what was next. Whereas she just wanted to come
Mm.
and be like steady Eddie and like work
Background. Yeah.
and get done and go home and did not have any career aspirations to go any further.
Hmm.
And, being a type A person myself, I was sort of originally kind of looking at that going, gosh, doesn't she want to do anything more? She could be so good
Yeah.
at this, she could be so good at that. And what I realized is she was doing me a huge favor by not
Yes.
being the person that was going to want to turn over in a year and go do something different on the team that I
Hmm.
was going to have to like kind of move the chess pieces all around again. And
Yes.
everyone else on support was like, I want to go into marketing, I want to go into product. And so
Yeah.
I realized the value of the B player.
Yes. Oh my
Solid
gosh.
contributor,
Yes.
doesn't have major aspirations to go do anything different, just wants to do her job and go live her life.
Right.
Those people are good.
They're gems. Yeah.
It's yeah,
Well, and part of what I also like is you realize the value of someone who was different than you.
yeah,
Like she came to her work with a really different approach to you did,
yeah,
and it was not the same as yours, and also as equal. It was as worthy
yeah,
as yours. So there it is. I think
yeah.
that's the inclusion
So,
detail.
yeah, include people.
Include people. There it is, in a nutshell. Well, we are essentially at time
Okay.
uh, for
Well, this
today.
was fun, Greg.
This
Thanks
was
for
great.
laughing at my coughing fit.
Always a pleasure.
All right, see you next time.
We see you next
Thanks,
time. Bye,
everybody.
everyone.